So,
I think we're about ready to start. Welcome everybody at Finch Court and those by way of webinar to our presentation by the North York Human Services and Justice Coordinating Committee. I'm Andrew Graham, one of the co-chairs, and attending in the court is Mary Murphy and Tammy Tinney, our other two co-chairs. And we're very pleased to be able to welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Gojer, today as our guest. The speed at which the webinar filled up, it was very obvious that I don't need to tell you about his outstanding credentials. He's a forensic psychiatrist, mostly based between Toronto and North Bay. So we'll start the presentation, and Dr. Gojer will answer as many questions from both the court and the webinar audience as time allows. I'd also like to say these things don't always go off with a hitch. We do have confirmation that many of you can hear us. If you can't hear us at home, please try and adjust your audio settings. So without further ado, we'll pass things over to Dr. Gojer. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome everybody to today's webinar, and a special welcome to my colleagues in North Bay. Keeping sane in an insane world. It's a controversial topic. We've already had some people commenting on the topic, but it has very little to do with the mentally ill. It's more to do with us as people caring for the disadvantaged and downtrodden. This presentation was not funded, and there's no conflict of interest at stake. At the outset, let me talk about trauma. Trauma is a difficult term to understand, and the DSM-5 captures trauma in the concept of PTSD, or the diagnosis of PTSD. And if people know about the DSM system, we would know that the criteria for PTSD has changed with every edition of the DSM, and we're now in its 5th edition. And trauma is defined in the PTSD section as an exceptional event that's out of the range of normal human experience, but it's associated with some characteristic signs and symptoms. The DSM doesn't capture features like complex trauma, compassion fatigue, or burnout. And this topic's more about compassion fatigue, where individuals experience post-traumatic stress-like symptoms without the same kind of trauma, but it's traumatic anyway to the individual. And on the way, compassion fatigue can lead to burnout, a state where people are unable to function at work. In order to understand trauma and stress, we might try to understand them as occurring on a spectrum where stress is at one end and trauma at the other. Stress is often seen when the coping mechanisms are taxed by exposure to an external event or accumulation of events. It leads to physical and psychological responses that impact on the person and those around. However, as I said, trauma is defined by a response to exceptional events, and it may be experienced directly or indirectly. For example, hearing the death of a loved one, or viewing some horrific event in the news that's actually close to you. So these experiences of trauma can also be vicariously experienced. It can be experienced across generations, and we know this as transgenerational stress or trauma. Other terms used are complex trauma, secondary trauma, and vicarious trauma. On the other hand, compassion fatigue is a form of emotional exhaustion that occurs after repeated exposure to the suffering of others while in a caring role, also known as vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. The definition comes from Balanovsky in 2013. However, if compassion fatigue continues, we get to a stage of burnout, where the person's coping mechanisms have been overwhelmed by repeated exposure to demanding situations, resulting in physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion. The person does not get any pleasure from work, wishes to avoid work, feels devalued, and develops a feeling of being incompetent. On the other hand, we can have what is called compassion satisfaction, where people working with trauma survivors get a profound, deep sense of job satisfaction in helping clients. Another term that's used that you may come across is emotional dissonance, where you're hearing your client talk about their stress and trauma, and you don't seem to be responding. And that's because there's a dissonance within you as to how you experience the stress of your client. In fact, there's an element of disconnecting from the client. Now, compassion, fatigue, and burnout are more often seen in healthcare workers who are exposed to the trauma of their clients. This also includes workers in disciplines like psychology, social work, and other allied specialities. We can't forget that court officials, police officers, lawyers, and judges are no exception. I've heard of court reporters being very distressed on hearing about some of the gruesome details when helping out at homicide trials. Now, do forensic psychiatrists experience compassion, fatigue, and burnout? And why I'm bringing this up is because of my good friend, Dr. John Bradford, also my mentor, who's written on the trauma of being a forensic psychiatrist in a paper called The Psychic Perils of Forensic Practice. There's often fears of testifying in court, fear of your personal issues being exposed in court, excessive demands and deadlines, pressure from lawyers to alter your opinion. But people often forget that we sometimes have to review horrific materials and we have to read horrific disclosure. Now, forensic psychiatrists are not the only people having to go do that. Police officers, crown prosecutors, judges, and defense counsel are all in that category. Let's look at lawyers. Lawyers have high rates of divorce in female lawyers. Studies of lawyers surveyed showed that many of them are dissatisfied with their jobs. Depression is 4 times more common in lawyers than in the general population, and that's a Johns Hopkins study. There are high rates of depression and suicide in lawyers. And of all lawyers in family and criminal law has the highest rate of secondary trauma as compared to other professions. And 51% of lawyers in a sample study showed stress higher than the general population. An important number of lawyers have significant or serious substance use issues. I was reviewing a 2010 study conducted by lawyers and support staff of the Wisconsin Public Defender's Office, and it showed that attorneys working with clients experiencing trauma and who worked long hours were at high risk of developing significant secondary trauma and burnout symptoms. Furthermore, studies on nurses have shown that they too suffer from burnout. Social workers, and especially in my practice, I've seen CAS workers at being at high risk of compassion fatigue and burnout. It goes without saying, police officers and paramedics, especially first responders, are at risk. We often forget about our judges who sit in court and seem to be quiet and isolated. They have deadlines to meet, complex cases to deal with. They struggle with the availability of courtrooms and put up with difficult attorneys and a pressure to project a sense of neutrality and remain stoic. They too are vulnerable. Having said this, I want to share with you a case that might highlight how trauma can impact on different people at different levels in a courtroom. And this case evoked multiple competing emotions and thoughts in the different parties involved. I'd also like you to examine your own emotions as I tell you the story. The case is JS versus PS as it's reported in the legal literature. It's a 2016 case decided in the Oshawa Superior Court on the 29th of August 2016. Mr. JS was referred to me for a psychiatric assessment. He was in his 40s and had been separated from his wife for about a year. He had met his wife on a plane when traveling from Vancouver to Toronto, and a quick friendship resulted in a marriage. The couple were not able to have a child. His spouse, PS, while on a trip to her country of origin, found a family who had a daughter who they wanted to give up for adoption. She arranged for the local authorities to create documents indicating that she had delivered the child in the country visited and brought the child back to Canada as her child and named JS as the father. Over a period of a few years, the marriage deteriorated. And though the parents' relationship deteriorated, they were both close to the young girl and competed for her affection. The child was intelligent, effervescent, and loved both parents. The child was about 5 years old when the mother began to talk about a potential separation. The father was opposed to the marriage breaking up and preferred to ride things out for the sake of the daughter. He was shocked one day when he was called by the police for an interview. He went to the police station and was told that his daughter had made an allegation of him sexually abusing her. He refuted the allegation. The police investigation did not go far and no charges were laid. He learned later that it was the mother who had gone to the police with the allegation. The relationship between him and the mother deteriorated significantly after that. In the months that followed, the mother approached several community agencies that included the police, shelters, family doctors, and the CS with further allegations of sexual abuse of the child. No charges were laid, but the CS began to investigate, and eventually the father was not permitted access to the child. Many family court hearings were held, and over a period of a year, the father gradually managed to obtain supervised access to his daughter. The mother pursued full custody of the child and was supported by legal aid in her endeavors. I did not mention this, but the mother also was a psychologist. The father retained counsel and argued for full custody, alleging that the mother was manipulating everybody through false claims of childhood sexual abuse of his daughter. The father's pitch to the court was that he should have full custody of the child and the mother could have supervised access and shared parenting only after she had recanted the allegations and had a psychiatric evaluation and counseling. At some point in time, the Office of the Children's Lawyer became involved. The Office of the Children's Lawyer recommended that the father have a full sexological examination. JS stated that he was prepared to do anything to prove the allegations wrong. The father was assessed by me towards the end of 2015, and the forensic evaluation included detailed documentary reviews, interviewing of the man, his family of origin, friends, and collateral sources. It also included phallometric testing, which did not reveal any anomalous sexual interests. A report was tendered and filed with the court. I was told that the matter was proceeding to trial in the late spring of 2016. The respondent's wife, PS, had many questions about my report and requested numerous clarifications, which I provided. She had a falling out with her lawyer as to how her case should be handled, and eventually her lawyer withdrew and she became self-represented. She made numerous attacks of a personal nature about the husband's lawyer, extending beyond the case and about his practice and how the lawyer handled himself or conducted himself in society. She then reported him to the Law Society, and the Law Society initiated an investigation. Her lawyer, Mr. Brian Ludmer, was very stressed out about now having to deal with a very complicated and difficult case, and also now handle his complaint to the Law Society. He talked to me about the considerable stress he had in dealing with the relentless personal attacks made by PS, his stress dealing with the case itself, and the Law Society investigation. In the report I prepared for him, I had suggested it would be prudent for Miss PS to have a psychiatric evaluation. I was shocked but not surprised when I received a letter in the mail that the College of Physicians and Surgeons were now investigating a complaint from PS about my practice, my assessment of her ex-spouse, and it also alleged bias on my part. I called the college investigator and advised of how my assessment was done, but was told that they were still proceeding with the investigation. I had to seek legal assistance. I was told that I had to testify in the matter in 2016. By this time, P had fired a lawyer and was handling her case on her own. Testifying in court is always stressful, and being cross-examined by a layperson is not easy, as many questions of irrelevance were asked of me. I realized that the presiding judge was attempting to balance different issues at stake and was doing her best to have a fair trial. The hearings concluded on the 16th of June 2016. I was in suspense what the college was doing with my investigation. My client's lawyer was in suspense as to what the Law Society was doing about his investigation. I had to let the college follow its process, and JS's lawyer had to leave the Law Society to do its investigation. A written decision was rendered, I think, on the 4th or 5th of August 2016. PS was ordered to give the child back to JS and was barred from having access to the child. This decision was emailed to me by counsel. A few days later, counsel for JS sent me an email advising me that PS had absconded with her child. The police found her and the child dead in a hotel room in Durham region. It appeared that she had killed the child and then taken her life. I called counsel and spent time talking about the events. I called JS, the father, who was devastated that the system had let his daughter down and had let him down. I called the Canadian Medical Protective Agency for further direction. I spoke to a few colleagues. The events were very painful to me and all people involved. I wanted to meet with all parties involved but was unable to. I wanted to grieve the loss with the father who did not want to talk to any mental health professional. He didn't trust anybody anymore. I knew counsel was deeply disturbed and distressed by the events, but he stated he was too busy and devastated and did not want to talk. I dealt with the aftermath of this event at my pace, privately, with no pressures, and with my friends. My friends are, like me, all overworked. I don't want to burden my family, contaminating them with my unpleasant feelings. I'm a proud psychiatrist, and I think twice about seeking a calling. I think about my new job and question the applications and questions in the application form about seeking help. After all, I'm a psychiatrist. I chose this job. I can cope. I can do it all. Doctor, heal thyself. I can't be weak. I have to be there for JS who lost his child, the lawyer who keeps things in, and the judge who must be hurting too. I have to be there for others. I have an image to live up to. I recognize how flawed my reasoning had become. I recognize the importance of talking things out. I recognize that what I was experiencing was not unusual. I recognize that in times like that, work can lose its meaning. I recognize winning cases for lawyers is important, but are we losing our mind in the process? All of us know somebody who has experienced PTSD, and no doubt experiencing it will significantly impact on your functioning. As I mentioned earlier, my mentor, Dr. Bradford, who had the opportunity to evaluate Paul Bernardo and Colonel Russell Williams, did develop PTSD. Have you thought about anxiety and depression that can be more subtle and destructive as layers of cases dovetailing, demanding of your time and preventing you from processing the aftermath of a previous case, one case following or flowing into the other, slowly taking its toll? You are sensitive, caring, and identify with your client's pain. You run the risk of experiencing compassion fatigue, an essential ingredient of burnout. Are you feeling nothing, but still talk to people as if you care? Maybe you're experiencing emotional dissonance, an ingredient of burnout. Have you become so desensitized that you're simply dealing with cases and not with persons? Have you lost empathy to the extent that the only thing that matters is the paycheck? Is all that matters is your economic survival? Have you lost your identity, and are you hiding behind the mask of being a mental health worker, forensic psychiatrist, judge, a lawyer, or a crown? Who are you? Can you recognize how your physical and mental health is a product of the construct of how you see yourself and your relationship to your profession? Are you hiding behind a facade of ultra-competence and think and need a drink or more for emotional strength at the end of the day? Are you a master of emotional avoidance? Who and where are you today? A few months later, I received a letter from the college to say that the investigation was closed. No explanations were given. I was reading some papers by Pross, who talked about Holocaust survivors from concentration camps and how German psychiatrists were assessing them. And he identified 4 different defense mechanisms used by these psychiatrists when they were evaluating these Holocaust survivors. The first one being denial, where there was an inability to identify with the person, but there was an identification with the aggressor and downplaying of the victim's suffering. Rationalization, dealing with the client in a matter-of-fact way and just be superficially caring. Thirdly, some of the psychiatrists who hated the regime that put these people into these concentration camps over-identified with the victim, satisfying their own narcissistic and omnipotent needs of bad-mouthing the former regime and failing to deal with the victim's own trauma. And lastly, psychiatrists who continued with controlled identification, who were open and receptive to the trauma story, who felt empathy but observed self-critically and were aware of reactions to the client and paced the sessions or interviews. I was also reading on personality types and burnout by Hawkins and Sohe, and he talked about 4 types who fall into the trap of being pseudo helpers for the trauma survivors. He talked about the wounded helper who identifies with the client and makes the person a project to be fought vigorously for. And then he talked about the martyr who takes on too many cases, complains, refuses help, and tries to satisfy his or her own neediness. The third being the narcissist who uses the client for self-aggrandizement, to get adoration and praise for the work that they've been doing. And lastly, the sublimated helper. Sounds like a positive personality trait, but it's not. This person uses the client to work through one's own negative attitudes towards life. And the helping is an antithesis to what the person's true motivations are in life. So we scoured the literature, and I would thank my colleague, Sheena Larose, who helped me out with this, who identified risk factors for burnout. You can see it in yourself, or we can see it among our colleagues. Individuals who are highly dedicated, perfectionistic, expect feedback and praise, and who have low self-compassion. Individuals who tolerate exhaustion at the expense for results. Individuals who've had their own personal traumas. Individuals who over-identify with the client and have poor social supports. We have some external factors, for example, handling a heavy or a complex caseload. Individuals who lack training or don't know when to refer the client on to somebody more senior or more experienced. Dealing with micromanagement or having very litigious clients. Dealing with clients who make the disclosure first to the individual. And working in real time with trauma clients. And lastly but not least, viewing graphic evidence and dealing with a counterproductive legal system. We then look at what people who might actually cope with burnout. Those who have high emotional intelligence and have the capacity for reflection and self-awareness. Those who have the ability to accept constructive criticism, who have appropriate empathy, set emotional boundaries, who are socially competent, and most of all, through the crying, still have the capacity to laugh and crack a joke, and have good coping and problem-solving skills. External factors that can help are having good social supports, having peer reviews, having debriefing sessions, balancing work and life, commitment to professional values, having supervisors who are supportive, having a reasonable caseload, and more often than not, continuing education and professional development. Lastly, it's time we all accept our limitations, that we need others, and it is not shameful to seek help, be it from family, friends, or professionals. Those in supervisory roles may want to think of staff and their emotional needs when factoring into the equation of budgets, staffing, and workloads. I want to give a special acknowledgement and thanks to Sheena Larose, a social worker at the North Bay Law and Mental Health Program, who helped to compile much of the research that I used in the preparation of this PowerPoint presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gojer, very much. I'm sure we'll be having questions coming in no time. So they'll be written in or where's the mic? So please feel free to send your questions to Dr. Gojer, and we'll gladly get to them.
Should I have to click on the day?
Oh, yes.